Good evening. Welcome to the Committee of the Whole meeting for February the 17th. I'll call the meeting to order. I'd like to welcome those attending in person here in Chambers. Thank you for joining us, as well as those online or watching later. I would like to respectfully acknowledge that we are meeting this evening on the traditional territory of the Wasanich people. And before I look to move forward with the agenda, I will turn to Mayor McNeil Smith for a statement.
Thank you, Chair. And tonight is the first time our council has met since we learned about the tragic shooting in Tubler Ridge a week ago today. There are no words that can fully express the shock and heartbreak that we feel as we continue to mourn the lives that were taken far too soon. Our thoughts and prayers are with the families and loved ones whose lives have been torn apart by unimaginable loss, and with a community that is deep in shock. We extend our gratitude and respect to first responders, teachers and school staff who acted with courage and compassion in the face of this tragedy, and we hold the students close in our hearts and our thoughts as they try to make sense of what has happened. Our Sydney community stands in solidarity with the people of Tumbler Ridge as they begin the long and difficult journey of healing. As an acknowledgement of this profound loss of life, our town flags are lowered to half-mast. And let us pause and take a few moments of silence for reflection on the brave people of Tumbler Ridge. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mayor McNeil Smith. Moving forward with approval of the agenda, I'll look for a motion to approve the agenda. Councillor Duck, Councillor Novak, all in favor? Motion's carried. Approval of the minutes of the regular committee of the whole meeting from January the 19th.
Point of order, Chair. I think we probably should add that late letter.
Thank you. Thank you. We did have a letter circulated to committee this afternoon, which is a reference to agenda item 6A. That item was submitted by V. Kleber, and it is in receipt of committee. Thank you very much. That is added to the agenda. With that, I will look to, I've got a seconder here as well. Councillor Novak, I'll call the question. All in favor? Motion's carried. Thank you. Moving to public participation. This is committee of the whole public participation, and so we have a maximum of 20 minutes set aside, 4 minutes per each speaker. We ask that you please try and keep your remarks precise and to that 4-minute mark. We also ask that individuals speak to items that are on this evening's agenda. When you come to the podium, please state your name and municipality of residence. And so I'll call for a first time for any public participation. Call a second time. And I'll welcome Mr. Trelevin to the podium. If you just press the button on the microphone, please, Mr. Trelevin.
Thank you. And just before I start a question, the budget is on the agenda.
Yes, sir.
The budget includes the funding for councillors and mayor's salaries.
Yes, sir. It's in the 5-year financial plan.
Correct.
So that revision is for the 2027
I can speak to that
budget.
issue as a part of the budget.
You may, sir.
Just to be sure. This is an extremely busy day. It's Shrove Tuesday. It's the start of Ramadan, and it's the beginning of the Chinese New Year. Against, obviously, incredible tragedy in the province and in the country. That is unspeakable. There's no question about it. I watched with great interest the debate that took place in this council chamber over council salaries and the mayor's salary. You all deserve, as do all elected officials and all who run for office in this broader community and across the country, a huge debt of gratitude from the public, the taxpayers, the people receiving services. But I think on salaries, you have put yourselves in a almost untenable position. The salaries of public officials, elected officials, are subject to a very special process because a municipal council, I don't have to tell you, gets hired by people like me, the voter, every 4 years. And at the end of a cycle, it held to my view and the voter's view of the performance, the judgment, the ability to handle questions or handle crises, handle issues. I noted in the methodology that you have adopted that a significant part of it appears to rely on comparables. I do not believe there's a single valid comparable for Sydney Council, in the sense that I'm not voting for you to be a member of the Victoria Council, regardless of what they pay. I'm not voting for you to be a member of the Colwood Council, whatever they pay. I believe that, another small point, that it's a difficult position to put staff in to be involved at all in the process where you set the salaries that you require. I can't imagine a corporation that turns to its staff to have any input at all on the salaries of the board of directors. What I would like to see is that, of course, an elected body like yourselves, you take a decision and you stand by it. I have to say, as a taxpayer in this city, I was a little disappointed that there wasn't a full council present for such a decision. And I appreciated very much the mayor's intervention in that debate. I would also say that it was partway through the debate that Councillor O'Keefe pointed out that the councillor and mayor's salaries have not been neglected since 2014. In fact, they've been subject to COLA. So one way or another, the salaries have been protected against inflation. The debate, therefore, is not about COLA. It's not about keeping pace with inflation. It's about what has changed in your job since the last time there was a major review in 2014 that requires action. I heard one intervention in that regard having to do with accessibility to this council by the whole community. That's a very interesting point. But I didn't hear another comment on what were the challenges that are more significant now than they were in 2014, and how do we compensate for that? That, by the way, is not a question of comparability. And I don't know what the answer is, and you know very well that when the Victoria Council tried to debated their salaries, their consultant compared Victoria to capitals across the country. So the council sat there, most of them, and agreed that although there were 96,000 people in Victoria, they were comparing their salaries to Edmonton with 1 million people. It's a very difficult area. I would say, take a decision and defend it to the community. Now, there's a small point. I think there should be more transparency in council and mayor salaries. Vancouver, to my surprise, has passed in the recent past a bylaw that requires elected officials reveal, it's not a secret, salaries they receive as a consequence of being elected officials in the city of Victoria and in the city of Vancouver. I think Victoria is doing the same thing, and the only position here, Mr. Mayor, is that you are the chair of the CRD, and as a result, your total compensation is considerably more than the town of Sydney provides for your position as mayor.
Mr. Trelawney, I'll ask you, we're approaching 5 minutes, I'll ask you to please
It is a
wrap
very
up your
challenging decision for any elected body to decide their salaries. I don't think comparables do it. I think the issue is far more difficult than that and far more important. And I wish that there was a full council discussion on what's changed substantively in your jobs that warrants the increase. Thank you.
Thank you. I will look again to the public. I'll call a third time for public participation. Please state your name and municipality of residence.
Hi there, my name's Jamie Wellborn. I live in Sydney. I'm here to speak on the budget process, just in general, and some suggestions. The budget process is full of difficult decisions. While the tax increase that's proposed is high, it does seem necessary to me that we have to stop kicking the can down the road to recover from COVID. I see that between some suggestions I have is that I see that between Parks and Engineering departments alone, we're spending over $170,000 a year on vehicles and mobile equipment. I would like to see the town consider offering like cargo bikes with trailers, that sort of thing, and to supplement the vehicle fleets in terms of finding ways to reduce the ongoing operating costs of these departments. And there's other places in the world where you'll see FedEx people delivering with cargo bikes and landscaping companies using trailers to haul their gear. It's definitely an option, and it would be a modest investment in bikes that could easily be covered by less wear and tear, gas, and other costs for the motor vehicle fleet. I'm also curious to see what the breakdown is of the annual roadworks a little bit more detailed. We see sort of big picture numbers in the budget, but we don't really see down to like the project level of this road needs repaving, etc. And I'm curious because I've seen in the past some roads that didn't really seem like they were that far gone getting repaved, and I feel like that could be a place where you could save some money and maybe cut some of the tax increase. And yeah, just my suggestion is to look outside the box for cuts with a couple suggestions there, and maybe look to find new ways to generate revenue. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Wellborn. Looking for a final call, public participation. Seeing none, thank you very much to those who came forward. Mr. Wellborn, would you mind just tapping the mic there, and that will disable that. And at this point, I would like to I failed to acknowledge the staff in attendance, but we have a number of department heads here this evening. Our fire chief is here as well, in anticipation of the introduction to the budget by Mr. Hissick, Chief Financial Officer. I'll also note that the town's Chief Administrative Officer is online this evening, Mr. Edwards, joining us from the Local Government Management Association conference. So thank you, Mr. Edwards, for joining us this evening as well. So with that, this evening is an introduction to the budget, and so like many of you, council saw this for the first time very recently. This is an opportunity for Mr. Hissick to take council and the public through the budget as has been proposed, and I'm anticipating Mr. Hissick will advise us at which points in the presentation he would like to take questions, and we'll yield to his preference there, and that to my colleagues that this is an evening to become familiar with the budget, and first opportunity to ask early questions, but really formulate them for our next budget meeting. So we're here as much to learn about this budget this evening as anything else. So as long as we're all on that same page, we're ready to move forward. Mr. Hissick, if you would please come forward for your presentation on the draft 2026 budget.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If you'll kindly indulge me, I need to re-log in here. I would like to start by just reiterating that I've seen many of your faces year after year in the budget process. Some of you have been here 9 or 10 times, others at least 3 or 4. But one reason I like to go through this introduction in detail is because there are many people out there who haven't heard the message. Clearly they haven't. I mean, some people only start paying attention when we get into double digits, and when it's a reasonable tax increase, they just let us do our thing. But once we get to where we have been the last couple of years, that's when they start paying more attention, and that's why I'd like to perhaps repeat some of the information that is second nature to most people at the table by now. Our budget process generally is a 3-parter. We start with introduction, which is tonight, which is a summary of the information that was provided to council late last week, some of which was on the agenda. I'm going to clearly outline the starting point for deliberations, and you've got the package. Some of you have already started asking questions about it. And Mr. Chair, in terms of when I would like questions, my preference would be perhaps at the end of the presentation, if there are any aspects that require a bit of clarity, that would be the best time. If there's something on the fly that is confusing, perhaps we could interject at that time, but my preference would be to leave it for the end. In terms of detailed questions about specific items, it would be my preference not to deal with those tonight. As mentioned, I'm starting to put together a list of those that have to be addressed for the next meeting, some of which will be in a detailed staff report. And that detailed report is often based on initial council questions. And we know half the content of what's going to be in there, but the rest of it will depend very much on what comes forward from council members as well as the public. The second meeting is scheduled for 2 weeks from tonight. It'll be what we call initial deliberations on the budget, the first chance to get into detailed questions, to make suggestions on additions, deletions, or amendments to the budget. An additional opportunity for public input, and as mentioned, a detailed staff report will complement the materials you've already been given. That will be followed roughly 2 weeks later by what has typically been final deliberations, our third meeting, which will include direction from the second meeting being worked into a second draft of the budget, perhaps an updated presentation indicating where we are in the process. And the goal of that third meeting would be to approve the financial plan as amended. Tonight's goal, as mentioned, is to introduce the financial plan, to provide an overview of the major impacts that have influenced its creation, to outline some of the major capital projects and supplemental items that have gone into it, and to add a little bit of context for your ongoing review of the budget documentation. And not just for you, I'm sure more and more members of the public will weigh in as well. Gentleman mentioned earlier what's changed since 2014, and one of the things that immediately jumps to mind is the level of public scrutiny that all of you are under. And certainly once we get into the kind of increases we've seen last year and this year, that scrutiny will increase, as will all the comments on social media, which also didn't exist to the extent it does 12 years ago. Setting the context for what we're facing, and really this is a continuation of what was presented last year and what council and town staff have been dealing with since the COVID pandemic in 2020. That really started us down the road of where we are today, and even though it's a bit repetitive, I think it truly does bear repeating and reinforcing, because it all makes sense if you follow the dots. The 2020 tax reductions that happened following COVID meant that we had actually just completed our budget process when the pandemic really hit us. So we reopened it, and we decided to roll back the draft very modest tax increase that we had previously approved, and further to that, to cut commercial taxes by 10%. So we went backwards in that year. And shortly thereafter, we were lucky enough to be awarded a Safe Restart grant from the senior governments through the province, and that truly did help us with recovery not only that year, but in the following years as well. But we knew at that time that eventually we'd have to bring our tax revenues back to the level where they should have been without this windfall temporary funding. In addition to that, time didn't stop. New service demands kept coming at us, which we added to the budget over the last 6 years. We have to account not only for the tax revenues that were foregone, but also the new services that were added. So the Canada-BC Safe Restart did help us to replenish the surplus that we used in the initial years to help balance the budget. It made it easier for us to maintain that tax reduction and the 10% reduction for commercial taxes, and it helped to bridge the gap between commercial and residential tax rates over the last 6 years. The last small portion of Safe Restart funding was used up in 2024, and we've been fully on our own since last year. But we all knew that the phase back would take more time. We knew it would take more than a year, and that was certainly the message delivered last year, and I think Council fully acknowledged it, knowing that year 2 of the phase back would once again be a little more painful than we're used to. Inflation has also had a tremendous impact over the last 6 years. The COVID-related supply chain disruptions led to the largest inflation I've seen in my time as a chief financial officer. In fact, the largest since probably the early 90s, as high as almost 7% for the 2023 budget year. It was lower in 2024, but still higher than we're used to, and it has somewhat abated for the last 2 years at 2.5% and at 2.3%. And again, what we're talking about is CPI, a measure of the traditional basket of goods that the typical household would purchase. It's not really the best measure for municipal costs. We're impacted far more by factors that impact construction, like fuel prices, like the construction costs in general, materials for construction, that kind of thing. And really, it's the cumulative effect of all that inflation that's reducing our ability to keep tax increases to a minimum. Everything costs more, and we're not immune to that reality. Break up all the verbiage with the occasional chart. And I should apologize. I know my slides are typically full of a lot of words, but it's my way of keeping up with what I want to say, and it's also good point form information for members of council or the public who want to hear the messaging as they go along. So this chart shows how inflation spiked between 2021 and 25, and even though it's leveled off in terms of ongoing increases, it doesn't mean that the price levels we saw back at the spike level have gone back to what they were before. It's leveling off, but those increases remain with us. So as mentioned earlier, in addition to inflation, we've seen expanded areas of responsibility over not just the last 6 years, but you could go back a lot further than that, maybe even 10 or 20 years, and those have had a cumulative effect. So we're under ongoing pressure to respond to service needs previously outside our mandate, like affordable housing, homelessness, climate change, accessibility improvements, economic development, reconciliation initiatives, more recently, police dispatch services, emergency management, first responder. Those things have been, especially first response, that has been over 20 years in the making, but it's cumulative and it does catch up to us. So all while grappling with our traditional responsibilities like infrastructure replacement and expanding recreation opportunities, we have all those new responsibilities to account for as well, out of our fairly limited range of revenue sources. So what's the tax increase? Well, you've all seen it through the budget materials, but our financial plan starts out with a general tax increase of 12.4% for this year. That includes several new budget items that Council has not yet made a decision on, and those are all subject to Council approval. Some are more discretionary than others. Some are simply unavoidable, and I'm highlighting them here for everyone's information. We're going to cover what's included in the above figures and identify some of the areas to focus on as we move through the process. So each and every year we begin the process with a realistic look at what revenue we need to carry out our mandate for us to deliver the services that we've been asked to, or the ones that we think are worth considering. So it doesn't mean that we have to end up at 12.4%. It's just a starting point. As mentioned, there are several supplemental items to consider, and some initiatives might be deferred. But unfortunately, there's very little latitude to pull more funding out of surplus as we have done over the last few years, because we are below policy levels, as Council has known for some time. And a detailed report was considered in conjunction with last year's budget, where we decided to use a higher level of surplus for one more year, being 2026, before we take a serious look at replenishment. And a report on that will come forward prior to next year's budget. Not sure. Not yet. So why are we here? We've covered some of this, but I'm going to go into a little more detail and provide some numbers for you. So the tax reductions in 2020 due to COVID, and then we had ongoing concern over the impacts over the intervening years, worried that our community would not be able to keep up with rising costs. We mentioned the extraordinarily high inflation, the ongoing need to increase services, especially in the protective areas such as RCMP and fire and first responder. So the Canada Safe Restart Grant was a blessing and a curse. It provided a false sense of economy in that we were using up that funding instead of taxing to the level we probably should have been to make the increases a little more even over time. So in the year of COVID, property tax revenues were reduced by $576,000. But the expenditure level stayed at the normal level that we required to fund our services. We knew then that we'd have to make up the lost tax revenue over time. And that Safe Restart Grant just gave us a bit more leeway in phasing back to it. But it also gave us the I don't want to say luxury, but it kind of was back in the day of deferring those tax increases that we knew were inevitable. So the cumulative Safe Restart funds that we used to make up for lost revenues were $2.1 million, which would equate to a tax impact of over 15%. So if we didn't have that mitigating funding, taxes would have had to be increased by over 15% over the years where we used that funding for paying for our services. So each year we require some growth in our revenues to keep up with rising costs, whether it's inflation, adding new services to our budget, or a combination of both. And every time we fund that new revenue is something other than taxes, we're kicking the problem down the road. We're deferring the tax increases we know are due. So the tax increases that we have been putting off have, as of last year, truly become due. And this is the second year of what I would call extraordinary increase to get us closer to where we need to be. Our job is not done after this year, but I think the two most difficult years would be behind us. But the more we choose to cut this time, the worse it'll be in the upcoming years. So this table illustrates what I've been saying about using other revenues instead of taxation. So in the initial year, the required tax increase would have been 5.66%, but we had the safe restart. We used a bit more of surplus, and we kept the tax increase to 0 or minus 10% for commercial. In the following year, we once again used a big chunk of the safe restart, another contribution from surplus, and the tax equivalent of those funding sources was over 7.5%. So the required tax increase over those 2 years would have been over 10%. And 2022 and 3, same story. We used safe restart, we used more surplus, we kept tax increase artificially low, and we got further behind the 8 ball. And then we got to 2025, there was no more safe restart, surplus was beginning to run out, and what we saw was our first double-digit tax increase since around 2001, 2002, around there, right after the our CMP detachment was built, in the late 90s to early 2000s. This is same information with prettier colors. So this shows what our revenue increase needed to be each year. So the blue portion of the of each year is what I call mitigation. So that's either grant or surplus funding, whereas the green is the tax increase that we actually applied. So if we didn't have the mitigating funding, all those numbers, all those points on that chart would have been green for tax increases, but we did have it. So it's the blue over those intervening 7 years that we're starting to make up for now. As you see in 2025, the green was a bigger proportion of the revenue requirement, and in 2026 it's once again a much bigger portion because we have no other choice. So this is something I showed last year, just a scenario where we looked at what it could have been like if we had applied a 3% annual tax increase starting in 2021, again in 22, 23, and 24, what impact it would have had on last year and on this year. So as you can see, it would have taken what were relatively modest actual tax increases in those years and made them a little higher. But what it would have done in the last couple of years is brought the number down by a few percentage points. So it would have been a little more even distribution had we followed this path, but we didn't, and here we are. With that introduction out of the way, I'll very quickly cover what makes up our complete budget. So a glossary of budget terms, if you will. So we have water, sewer, and general operating funds. Each one of them is funded separately. Water and sewer are through parcel taxes and user rates, and the general fund is through taxation and some other revenues. So each one of those funds has an operating and capital component, and key features of the funds will be highlighted. So when we talk about capital budgets, it's the big stuff. I think everyone understands what capital is. It's renewal of existing infrastructure or adding other large assets to our inventory for purposes of providing public service. So it's new items or projects, and it's presented in terms of ongoing programs, new items, or annual programs we tend to have or carry forwards from previous year. So all funding sources are identified, and the level of annual tax funding is only a tiny proportion of our capital funding, and it's a relatively consistent amount from year to year. However, even though it is such a small amount, it's those tax-funded items that receive the most attention, those are the ones that impact the tax increase most immediately. We have what we call supplemental requests or items, which are part of the operating budget, and those are changes to existing service levels, new or additional items. Often they're one-time studies or minor operating items, but they can also be major ongoing things like firefighter hiring plan, or what we see this year, the requirement to take on policing dispatch on a permanent basis. Sometimes the supplemental requests come from external agencies, like some of our partner agencies for community support. There are no such increases this year, but we've seen them over the last few. There tend to be some of these every year, and it's really the change in total cost from the previous year that's identified as the tax impact. So the more significant items are backed up by more detailed reports that you'll see on your next agenda and are better described in your budget document. So we have what we call our base budget, which is developed to maintain existing levels of service, i.e. what does it cost us to provide the service that has been previously approved by council through past budgets. So the level of grass cutting, the level of road maintenance, the level of community support, that's been approved over the years by council. Some of them are subject to inflation. Others are static, but like I mentioned earlier, inflation does mean that we need some new revenues every year. It's just unavoidable. I don't think any household goes from one year to the next without seeing some increase in the amount of money it costs just to run your household. And we don't budget for worst case scenarios by any means. We budget for a most likely case based on the collective experience of the people in this room. We have experienced professionals who know what it costs to provide the level of service they've been asked to provide, and that's what we bring forward to you. Departmental budgets are developed on a bottom line basis for each function. Sometimes there are movements from one area to another, but the bottom line we try and keep to the smallest overall increase that we possibly can. Individual line items are only a best guess of the mix of labor, contract, and materials that we need in any particular year to get our job done. And it's not always an increase in every function. We do look for efficiencies where possible, but that's getting more and more challenging. We'll talk about reserves as we go through the process, which are funds we set aside for specific purposes. And once created by bylaw, reserve funds can only be used for their intended purpose. We have reserves for asset replacement, things like roads, drainage, water and sewer infrastructure, as well as for vehicle and computer equipment, and also for the ferry terminal. We have some less defined reserves, like the general capital, which we started up a number of years ago to try and get a head start on facility funding. And we also have a number of what I would call other reserves, like the land sale reserve, amenities, climate action, as well as occasional funds that are provided to us by senior government that we are required to put into a reserve for specific uses. The Growing Communities Fund is the biggest example of that right now, but also the Canada Community Building Fund, previously known as the gas tax, which comes to us externally, but we keep in reserve. And we always grapple with what's the required balance in each reserve. Some make more sense than others. Some are easy to establish, like vehicles, computers. But even those are becoming more complicated in this inflationary climate. Others require more investigation, such as the infrastructure reserves. Reserve balances will be cyclical. Some years we'll put in more money than we take out. Others will be taking more out to finance larger capital projects. We have very limited reserve funding for things like buildings, for which we've tended to borrow for over the years, and also for waterfront infrastructure like the wharf and the pier. So we could choose to build up reserves for those things, but it'll take time to get there. And if council feels that a large capital project is worth doing prior to us accumulating those funds, then borrowing remains an option for us. This is a tabular snapshot of all our reserves right now. It shows the beginning balance, which are 98% accurate pending the completion of our year end. Got our 2026 contribution amounts showing in the second column. Projected uses in our capital plan are in the next column. And the projected ending balance in the final column. As you can see, two of our vehicle reserves are already in the hole at the beginning of this year due to a couple of significant purchases over the last couple of years. So we have a bit of work to do to get them back into the black. Certainly on the vehicle replacement side, we had two very large purchases that were completed over the last couple of years that council was aware of. And those unfortunately came at the wrong time, but they're vital equipment that will serve us for many years. You'll see that we're projecting to transfer in only $4 million, I should say, this year, and to take out as much as 11.2 million if all our capital projects are completed this year. So it will take a big chunk out of them, and we have some work to do to make sure that future contributions are at the level that we require for timely replacement of our infrastructure. Quick word about debt, borrowing. Everyone at the table knows this, but it's worth reinforcing that we are only able to borrow for capital needs. We cannot borrow for ongoing operations such as senior governments are able to do. We have to have a cumulative surplus that's on the positive side. We can't fund operations through borrowing. Typically, we've borrowed in the past for buildings and for some major park improvements over the years. A little bit is included in the current financial plan that I'll cover in more detail later, but we have a lot of capacity. We have increased ability to borrow assent-free, although it's always subject to council decision. But if the decision is that certain projects cannot wait for an accumulation of reserve funding, then it's good to know that we have this funding source that's available to us. We do have relatively low levels of debt, which is measured as a proportion of our annual revenues. Right now, we have borrowing of about $10 million, and our servicing is very affordable. We're also allowed to borrow short-term, so up to 5 years, and we can access, it's actually higher than that now, after a change that was put in place last year. But for short-term borrowing, we can borrow up to about $1.9 million. So in terms of how we develop the budget, it comes from a variety of sources. We have council requests over the course of the year, we have community requests, and we have the best judgment of our trained, experienced staff to maintain what we have, to make a purchase to reduce ongoing operating costs, or to add new features or amenities that we believe will benefit the public. So we take our roles very seriously and bring forward ambitious plans each year to address service expectations. Obviously, as we're dealing with higher and higher tax impacts, we might have decisions to make over the next few years about separating the must-haves from the nice-to-haves. That's one way to reduce our spending and reduce our tax requirement. Mr. Chair, can I ask how the pace is? Is it,
Thank you. Unless my colleagues disagree, I think we're pleased at the pace at which this is moving. Gives us a good opportunity to reacquaint ourselves with the status and process. Thank you.
okay? So I'll start with the water utility. It includes the bulk water purchase through the Peninsula Water Commission and the CRD, which is a big proportion of the cost, as well as the operation and maintenance of our distribution system. It also includes infrastructure renewal and capital projects. It is funded with parcel taxes, or infrastructure levy, as I like to call it, and user fees. And the infrastructure levy is projected to go up by $20 this year to $95 a year. The fixed quarterly charge is projected to increase by 50 cents per quarter to $25. And the consumption charge is projected to increase 7%, which is strictly to match the bulk water rates that we're subject to $6.86 per 1,000 gallons of consumption. The reasons for those projected increases are we need to set aside a little more into our infrastructure reserve. Last year we increased it a little bit, but we need to keep going. We've had a couple of significant projects last few years that have really taken a big chunk out of our reserves. You'll recall the Lochside Water Main project and more recently the Weiler. Those ran into significant cost impacts, both from inflationary factors as well as additional complications, and unfortunately we have to replenish the water reserve over the next several years. So that $20 increase to the infrastructure levy is going to be matched entirely to an increase in the reserve contribution. And as mentioned, the CRD bulk water rate went up by 7%, which accounts for the entirety of the user rate increase. So you'll recall that in 2021 we instituted a new water rate structure, and we've had 5 years of experience now. It's working remarkably well. It's provided stable revenues to match our cost structure, and it's a better matching of fees paid to the benefits received from the water system. And as you'll shortly see, we've tried to apply the same methodology to sewer rates. The sewer utility is the next subject of discussion, and that includes the town's share of operating the unified treatment plant as well as the operation and maintenance of our collection system. We pay for the infrastructure renewal and capital projects that are related to it. Again, like water, it's funded with the infrastructure levy and user fees. So what we'll be proposing very shortly to council, in fact at the next meeting, is a new unified infrastructure levy rate of $100 as opposed to a dual level rate that we've had for many years, where it was $65 for strata properties and $130 for non-strata. We're looking to kind of even that out. And the user fees, we're going to be proposing increases to the way we collect them that are going to be more aligned to the way we do for water. And the choice we have to make is either adopt the new rate structure or simply increase our user rate. The revenues we need are non-discretionary. It's just how we choose to get there. And we'll be reporting on the impacts and the proposed rate changes at the next meeting. So the reasons for the increase on the expenditure side are largely the increases for the joint treatment plant, which are levied to us annually by the CRD, and we collect the revenues to pay for it through sewer charges. In addition, we are facing higher infrastructure renewal costs. It's similar to water. It's especially acute these last couple of years and in the anticipated near term because of the urgency of renewing some of our pump stations. So we've exhausted surplus as a source of funding in the sewer utility, as we have in general. So last year we saw our largest rate increase in quite a number of years. This year it's going to be more modest. It's just going to be allocated in a different manner. So the general operating fund provides for all the municipal functions other than water and sewer. We can ignore garbage for now. That's also a subset, but it is part of the general operating. That also is self-funding. So the program areas under general operating are legislative and general government, protective services, which is police, fire, emergency, bylaw, building inspections, engineering and works, waste services, environmental services, and municipal planning. We also have parks and what we term cultural, being the library, senior center, as well as the historical museum and the Shaw Center, which we support. We also have fiscal services, which are transfers to reserve, as well as debt repayment and community support. Significant impacts for the general operating fund include supplemental requests, which are higher than we've seen for a number of years. So we're looking at a net increase of just under $900,000 for this year, plus the full impact of a couple of items from last year, another $55,000. Our CMP costs, as every year, tend to go up by roughly 1% of taxes just for the RCMP contract. In addition to that, this year we have the dispatch costs. You'll recall that last year we elected to fund the first year of dispatch from surplus because there was still a remote possibility that it might be rolled back or we would get continued provincial grant funding. That didn't happen, and this year is an ongoing part of our budget. The responsible thing to do is to include it as part of our annual budget, which requires ongoing property taxation. The impact of that item alone is roughly 2.3% of the 12.4. In total, the our CMP cost impacts represent 4% out of that 12.4. You can add roughly 1.4 for fire, so about 5.4 of the 12.4 are for emergency services. Reserve contributions add another roughly 1%. We're contributing an additional $156,000 out of the general fund, plus an additional $107,800 from water and sewer. In terms of personnel costs, there's one RCMP administrative position that was approved by council late last year, which adds roughly $48,000 to the budget. That's the only full-time position we are adding. There are 2 part-time positions being requested as supplemental items, which are subject to discussion and consideration. Should be noted that our 2 collective agreements expired at the end of 2024. So while negotiations did begin on one of them in 2025, they have not been concluded and will carry on into this year. The second one, negotiations started very recently, and we expect that to be concluded over the next 2 months or so. We have a reasonable idea of what the impact of that one will be on pure salaries, but there are non-salary impacts that will likely come out of it, largely based on scheduling changes that will have to be implemented, which might require an additional firefighter. Perhaps this year, perhaps next, it's uncertain. And it'll likely require some increases to our overall volunteer compensation just to kind of keep up with the curve based on what's happened regionally and sub-regionally in the fire service. I should also point out that roughly a 1% tax increase is from a WorkSafe BC payroll increase that was completely outside our discretion. It has nothing to do with our own personal claims experience. It's province-wide. So our sector was impacted by a rate increase that resulted in an additional $150,000 in cost, which is just under 1%. So we've mentioned the reductions in offsetting revenues, so I won't harp on about Safe Restart again, but I will talk about surplus. So we are using roughly $400,000 less in surplus to balance the budget than we did last year. So that alone is a good 2.5% increase right there. And we can't use more because we've fallen well below policy levels. And to some members of council, when we discussed this in detail this time last year, you were rightly concerned, as am I, and we'll be considering it following this budget process. But the decision was made last year to use it to mitigate the impact one more time, and then we'll get serious about replenishment over an indeterminate number of years. So we always have a little bit, well, not always, almost always have a little bit of additional revenue through growth in the tax base. The largest amount we've had recently was in 2023 when we saw $400,000 in new revenue. Last year there was nil, but fortunately we're back to about $180,000 for this year. And because of, we have a lot of pent-up building projects that are either being reviewed or about to be reviewed for issuance of building permit. And that will not only bring in additional building permit revenues in the near term, but add to our tax base as those construction projects are completed. Certainly the new hotel on the west side, that's only partly reflected in the new tax revenues for this year, and the rest of it will be next year. I understand it should be complete by sometime this spring. So, reserve funds and infrastructure replacement. As I mentioned earlier, the inflationary climate has taken a real toll on our balances, and certain reserve contributions need to be enhanced. On the general side, it's a little bit better. Perhaps the one gap would be on the storm drainage infrastructure. Our roads aren't too bad. Our biggest issues are in the underground, so not just storm drainage, but water and sewer. And as mentioned, those are being increased this year and are projected to continue going up over the rest of the 5-year plan. So it's one thing to increase reserve contributions, but it'll take a number of years to replenish. And if we come across a critical capital project that cannot wait for that full replenishment, we might have to consider some borrowing to enable that project to take place. Another impact is the active transportation plan. So when that was adopted a number of years ago, we were directed to spend an average of $1 million per year on implementing it. It's a noble goal, but we have limited internal funding to pay for that level of investment. So we've been reliant on grants, which are uncertain. We've been lucky so far with receiving one for our first major project, but there are no new grants on the horizon, although every opportunity we get will continue to apply. So if we want to carry on with that level of annual investment and we don't get the grants, we'll have to once again consider borrowing if the project is deemed important enough. I'll quickly take you through our departmental operating budgets and highlight some of the major impacts on each. So for legislative services and general government, we're looking at an increase of roughly $228,000 over last year on a total net budget of $3 million. So $72,000 of that is for supplemental items, mostly the ongoing civic sites development project. There's slight increases for elections this year. So what we found is, unfortunately, costs have gone up since the last election for things like the rental of the voting machines. And we'll be having to, what we do is we set aside an equal amount of funding over the 4 years to try and keep it from being one large bump every 4 years. And we're going to have to increase our annual contribution a little bit in anticipation of the 2030 election. So another increase in general government was for software licensing. And I want to highlight this because it will lead to some offsetting savings. So we've enhanced our licensing for our suite of products that will enable us to provide services like VoIP telephoning from our computers rather than having to invest in hardware. So you're going to see an increase in licensing costs on the operating side, but there will be less of a hardware requirement going forward. And we're just, this is also related to our electronic data records management system that we're beginning to implement. All those things require additional, enhanced licensing capabilities. Protective services, we've talked about this a lot, but just quickly highlight the net increase is $670,000 over last year, with the RCMP contract contributing to that, as well as dispatch. The additional staffing is full-time, not part-time. That's an error on the slide, but that was approved last year, and the relatively low amount reflects the fact that it's a cost-shared position with North Saanich. The detachment is shared with North Saanich, and the province also kicks in a percentage because there are provincial federal members that are housed in the detachment. Fire and emergency, the net increase over last year is $310,000, mostly due to supplementals. So there's an amount of $170,000 in there this year for anticipated personnel cost increases, and we do not yet know how that's going to be broken out. It'll depend very much on negotiations, but that is our best guess as to what this year's impact will be. There's the full year cost of a position that was added last year, which was the second deputy chief. And we're facing a bit of an impact on vehicle operating and maintenance because of ongoing call volumes. It's increased use of our vehicles. And yeah, not sure this one's going to be possible to replace with bikes, but we'll do our best. Building inspection by law enforcement is a net increase of just under $80,000. There's a supplemental request for a part-time bylaw enforcement officer to assist with volumes, as well as a part-time building and planning clerk to assist in seasonal volumes for things like building permit, business license renewals. We are expecting building permit revenues to bounce back after a couple of leaner years, as mentioned, because of those pent-up projects that have been approved but have not yet proceeded. Development services sees a net increase of $53,000. Once again, there are supplemental items in there. Provincial grants are helping to pay for some of the housing policy impacts that are in the budget on the expenditure side, but completely offset by provincial funding. Engineering and works has gone up by $211,000 on a net budget of $2.85 million, with over half of that being supplemental items, including the periodic Beacon Wharf inspection, which we do on a 3-year basis, as well as the Bevan Avenue traffic study, which is not one that we have done before. Environmental services is essentially a rounding error impact, as most of that function is funded through a provincial grant, the local government climate action program funding. Should that funding discontinue, we'd be faced with a decision on how and how much of our environmental services and projects we wish to maintain. Parks and cultural, again, a very modest increase on a net budget of $2.2 million, with virtually all of it being supplemental items. So it's a stable year following a larger than average catch-up increase that we saw last year, which was required to absorb a number of small ongoing impacts over the previous 5 or 6 years. Things like additional playground equipment, additional park space, more green space, downtown landscaping, things like more events, a longer growing season. Those kind of things do impact the operating budget. Fiscal services, the last portion of our general operating is things like reserve transfers and debt servicing. So we're seeing a net impact of just over $280,000, with most of that being reserve transfers. So last year, Council made the decision to put the annual capital works reserve contribution on hold. It's now being reinstated, which is 150 of that 156. Debt servicing, there's a supplemental item that is related to a capital request, and this will be covered in far greater detail in the staff report on the next agenda. But generally, there's a capital request for buying a prefab structure to replace our well past its best before date Public Works Administration building. And the cost of that would be financed through a 5-year short-term borrowing term. And we would need to account for that on the operating side in case the capital is approved. And options will be provided for that particular project in that staff report. Community support is relatively stable from last year. The largest impact for 2026 is a supplemental item which was described in your materials. So we've talked about what supplemental items are. They're covered in some detail in your budget materials. And for the more complicated items, the ones requiring more explanation, that will be included in the on the next agenda. The largest supplemental items are, once again, the RCMP dispatch at over 430,000, fire department personnel, 170, a variety of engineering requests totaling 132, 72 on the admin and corporate side, about 50 on parks and community celebrations, and others totaling 175 with the breakdown available to you. So the total 2026 impact of these items is over $1 million, but the net impact after the one-time request from last year reduce it to under 900,000. In addition to the ones having a tax impact, there are a few supplemental items that do not have an impact because they are funded from grants or other external sources, or in a couple of instances by the utility funds. Those are included and described, but they're not flagged here as tax impacts because, well, they're not. There are a couple of larger items in years 2 to 5 of the plan. The biggest example of that would be the RCMP Major Crime Unit, as well as additional fire personnel impacts and some more one-time or periodic studies that we undertake. So future year supplementals will be revisited. Just because it's approved in this financial plan doesn't mean they will necessarily go ahead without reconsideration. If we need a future year item to be initiated, we will come to you separately and ask for permission. Otherwise, you'll have a chance to weigh in again this time next year. But if it's an impact that we're aware of, we need to put it in the draft financial plan to provide a realistic look at what we're facing in the coming years. So this shows our very significant reliance on property taxation to fund our operations. We collect a little bit through fees and charges where we can. We have a small amount of government transfers to fund our operating. Use a little bit of reserves and surplus, but most of reserves are for capital. We have a little bit coming back from investments, a little bit in parcel taxes on the general side, but the vast majority, almost 70%, are from property taxation. And this is why when we have a cost impact, you know that a large proportion of the cost or of the revenue to pay for it is going to have to be from taxation if we want to move ahead with that initiative, assuming we have a choice. This is how our operating pie is divided. So you see that the biggest slice goes to police protection at 19.1% of our operating budget, followed by fire and emergency at 16.1%, public works at 15.6%, general government at 15%, recreation and culture at just under 10%, Transfers to infrastructure reserve also just under 10. Community support at 6.4. Planning, building, and bylaw at under 5. And the rest are very small pieces of the pie. I should say we're looking strictly at tax-funded expenditures here. If you were to look at overall public works expenditures, so if you're adding water and sewer to what we pay for out of general operating, it would be a very significant chunk, roughly 1/3 of our overall expenditures. But because those are self-funding, they are not illustrated here. This speaks only to how we use our property tax dollars. I'm not going to get into a lot of capital projects here, just highlighting the total program. So we're looking at projected expenditures of $13.6 million for the upcoming year, and over $10 million of that is for replacement plan projects. So infrastructure replacement is $9.2 million, and other replacements like vehicles, computers are $0.9 million. We have a small amount in recurring programs that we have every year. $3.1 million in one-time projects such as active transportation, park improvements, that kind of periodic or one-time initiative. Now, the 13.6 for 2026 does not include a few projects that are going to be carried forward from last year for completion. Those will be added at bylaw time in the spring. The reason they're not included is because they are already approved and in progress, and we didn't have an accurate enough projection of how much was remaining to be carried forward, or we just don't think as an ongoing project it's worthy of clouding everyone's binders and judgment as we talk about things that are still discretionary. So how do we fund that $13.6 million? 9.2 of it, virtually 3/4, comes out of reserves. And a further $1.6 million comes out of the Community Building Fund, which is also technically a reserve, but I wanted to highlight it separately. I'm projecting $1.3 million in grants for this capital program, although we do not yet have certainty that those have been approved. So you could say those projects may be conditional. I'm also projecting just under $1 million in borrowing, and we'll talk about that in more detail as we go through. But those are a few projects where, after having exhausted all possible funding sources, there simply was nothing left. So if we want to do those projects, if we deem them important enough, we might have to consider a small amount of borrowing. Minor amounts of funding this year are from carry-forward funds, a very little bit from current taxation, a tiny bit from North Saanich for cost-shared projects at RCMP or Rotary Park. And that's a very tiny amount for things like developer contributions. Can't remember what else goes into that 32,000. So the property tax funding for the capital program is very small, at just over 1% of taxes. We're starting out at 184,000, which is about 58,000 more than last year. But last year was among our lowest totals we've ever had. But we'll still get to go through that list of projects and decide whether any should be cancelled or deferred. So our average annual tax funding used to be much higher, but over the years we've had more and more reliance on internal and external reserve funds, things like the gas tax, amenity funds, land sale, which was largely from the sale of the old firehouse site, which helped to fund a lot of our capital program over the last few years, but that money has pretty much run out. We are running out of some of those temporary reserves like land sale, amenities. Community Building Fund continues to be replenished each year, but it's meant to be used up. That's the expectation from the federal government, and we're trying to use it as we go and essentially use up the entirety of the funding over the course of this 5-year plan. It's not meant to be kept for large projects beyond this 5-year plan. Tomorrow I'm communicating strictly in writing. Enough talking for 1 week. Infrastructure replacement, we've got over $21 million over the next 5 years, which I'm afraid is a little bit more than we can afford. If you look at the amount of projects we want to undertake and the amount of infrastructure reserve funding we have available, the two don't match up very well. So while we are trying to increase our reserve balances over the course of this 5 years, we're not going to have enough to do everything we want to do. So it's affordable this year for the most part, but we have some work to do ahead of next year's financial plan to truly dig in and separate the must-haves from the nice-to-haves, and report to council on any major projects that we feel are vital but cannot be undertaken at this time without perhaps some borrowing. We will, of course, be applying for ongoing grants, but until those are awarded, we can't bank on them. Additionally, we have $4.5 million in other asset replacements. We've got a large fire truck in the latter years of this plan. A couple of other larger vehicles, and again, as mentioned earlier, a couple of large purchases in the last 2 years have depleted the vehicle equipment reserve, and we're doing what we can to see what we can do for efficiencies to reduce the overall number of vehicles and how they're deployed. We have acquired a couple of smaller electric runabouts, if you will, for the park staff, and we'll take advantage of more of those as opportunities arise. The active transportation plan, we're trying to live up to that average of $1 million per year, but as mentioned earlier, funding for that is not readily available. We do have a large project in there for the ferry terminal in 2029, I believe, but again, that's contingent on assurance of return by a certain year. If it looks like they will not in fact be back by 2030, perhaps we can postpone that until we do have the assurances we need. Council can rest assured we will only spend on the terminal what needs to be spent to keep the asset in a condition that will allow future use. We have to anticipate that the run will return, so we have to keep the assets from deteriorating to the point where they cannot be used, and it'll require major investment. There are several park improvements included in the 5-year plan as well. What is not included is the Civic Sites project. Should we move ahead with replacement of the municipal hall or portions of the works yard, we do not yet have accurate estimates, and there's lots of engagement to be had before those are formalized. So just know that those could be large numbers, and they're currently not included. So we've talked a lot about ways we fund our financial plan. Surplus is one way, and it's a method we've used in all my time here to help mitigate the tax impact. Even though we're required to have an ongoing surplus from prior year's operations, that does not mean we can't have a deficit in any given year. And we have a long-standing policy that outlines what our minimum balance or surplus should be. We fell below that. We're still far from critical levels. We're just below our policy, and policies can be changed. And that'll be something for council to consider prior to next year's budget. So we use a certain amount of surplus to balance the budget each year. My comfort level is about $250,000 because I feel in a typical year we can generate that level of operational savings so that we don't actually need that surplus. We will break even. The last few years have been anything but typical, and for many reasons we've used a higher amount of surplus. And at that level, there can be no expectation of breaking even. We know we're going to keep dipping into our surplus and actually using it to pay for operations while still maintaining an overall positive balance. But by using a small amount each year, I look at that as a way of preventing overtaxing people. So we know we're going to generate some operational savings, so to tax for all of our needs would be, in my opinion, more than we need. Of course, that methodology was from the olden days before the current situations that we've been discussing for the last hour. But in the longer term, I still think that's a valid way to go from year to year. So we are using an extra large amount this year, roughly double what I'm typically comfortable with. But for the subsequent 4 years of our 5-year plan, I'm projecting just the $250,000 that is my comfort level. Covered that. Yeah. So again, I want to reinforce that we knew when our one-time gift funding ran out, we knew that we'd have to phase back to full taxation levels. We knew it would take more than a year. And we've known for a couple of years now that it'll take several years. And that must also be done in conjunction with potentially replenishing our surplus over the next several years as well. Once all other funding sources have been considered, we have to balance our budget through sufficient property taxes. So that's the roughly 7% of our total revenues. And the tax increase each year is partially mitigated by the new taxation growth that I mentioned. So it's $180,000 this year. That's our first little bit of new taxation before the general increase is applied across the board. So you all know that when it comes to tax rate setting, we have different rates for different classes of property. So residential pays a certain rate. Non-residential, being commercial and industrial, tend to pay at a higher rate. And the general changes in assessed value are factored out when we set our rates. So just because someone's assessment went up does not mean automatically that their taxes will go up too. So in 2022, Council approved a new policy that was meant to reduce the gap between residential and commercial rates. That was meant to be a 10-year phase-in. 2026 would be year 4 of that phase-in. But even though general tax increases in the first 2 years were slightly larger for residential than commercial, that has not been the case in in 2025 or projected to be this year. Because in 2025, you'll recall we saw a natural gap reduction between the classes because of the relative assessment changes. So it took no intervention on our part to narrow that gap. It was done for us. and that continues into this year. So in terms of what that means to our distribution policy, our practice from here on will be to keep the rates under the that 2.0 target that we set as our ultimate goal. So our increase in total tax revenues this year was 2.2 million. Last year it was less than that as a starting point, and that's allocated as 180,000 for the new construction and just over 2 million in general tax increases, which is roughly that 12.4%. This is that famous table which some people like, others loathe, but I try to break down the individual components of that 12.4% as best I can. So you'll see that the middle portion, the green portion, relates to our supplementals. So that's nearly, it's almost half of our total 12.4%. So it's the full year impact of last year's additions. It's the one-time and continuous supplemental request for this year, offset partly by the one-time requests from 2025. In the top yellow section, you've got roughly $360,000 in what I call contractual personnel increases. So these are related to the anticipated collective bargaining increases, as well as anything that's tied to it. The increase in WorkSafe rate I mentioned earlier, our CMP contract of 178,000, reserve transfers, a little bit more in tax-funded capital, a little bit more in debt servicing, and roughly 200,000 in miscellaneous operational, which is mostly inflation-driven. The offsets to that, there's a negative offset, if you will, of a decrease in surplus funding. There's that 180,000 offset I just covered, and the overall result is 12.4%. And every 1% increase in taxes brings in 163,582 in additional revenue. So it's not a lot. And each 1% represents approximately $1.65 per month for the average residence. So at 12.4%, it would be roughly $20 per month for the average. And this illustrates it better. So, forgive the 12.85 at the top, it should say 12.4. If we were to apply that 12.4%, it would increase the annual municipal taxes for the average residence by $246 per year. Those are partially offset by the overall change in the parcel taxes. So water is slated to go up by 20, and sewer is slated to go down by 30 for those who were paying the higher rate before. So the overall increase on the tax notice would be $236, which is just under $20 a month. We're trying to project the impact on the quarterly utility bill with the proposed rates. So you'll see that the quarterly bill for the average household would go up roughly $450 per quarter prior to consideration of the sewer rates, because council will have options on which of the two ways to go on sewer rates, so we can't accurately predict what that'll be here. For a commercial account, it's a little bit higher, but you can see that the projected utility bill increase will be roughly $5 to $6 per quarter, pending the outcome of the sewer rates. So a 5-year projection of where we might go with our tax increase, showing that this year we're looking at 12.4. Next year, it levels off a little bit at just under 7%, and then further reduces over the intervening 3 years. However, again, that's before considering the potential impact of replenishing our surplus levels. Should council choose to add a percentage of taxes each year for that purpose, those would be added on to these projections for 2027 through 2030. But because we have a wide range of discretion as to what level we're going to bring it back to, if any, and how long of a period we choose to do that, I have not included any projection for that at this time. So I'm projecting roughly 200,000 in new tax base revenues over the next 4 years. It could be higher if all the projects that are on the books right now proceed, but I'm being a little conservative at this time. And again, any changes to the tax impact in year 1 will just push that revenue requirement down the road and increase the opening figure for year 2 and so on. So year 2 is often overstated in this kind of projection, but that hasn't been the case the last 2 years for the reasons we have discussed at length, not just tonight, but last year as well. So last year we projected a slightly lower year 2 starting point, but we're a little bit higher than we thought we would be. And as always, the last 2 or 3 years of the plan tend to be understated because we know things are coming at us. I put in a plug for anticipated supplemental items, but I can't anticipate everything, and this is our best guess at this time. I'd be remiss if I didn't cover the results of our recent citizen satisfaction survey, which showed that overall 86% of respondents thought they received very good value or fairly good value for their tax dollars. And further, that when given the choice of what to do when faced with cost increases, 62% of respondents voted to either increase taxes to enhance or expand services, while 43% voted to increase taxes to maintain services at current levels. Only 26% of respondents thought that we should look at cutting services to keep taxes down. So, in all fairness, the survey went out before last year's tax notice was received, but I'd like to think that these results, which mirror the ones from our last syndicated survey, are an accurate reflection when you consider the value people perceive from municipal services and the fact that even at 12.4%, we're just looking at $20 a month. So quickly, the goals of our second meeting are to provide additional details to council and the public on the newer or more complex budget items, provide council and the public with an opportunity to ask questions, and then council to make recommendations on adding, deleting, or amending certain items that are proposed. It'll provide taxpayers with another opportunity to comment on what is or is not included in the draft budget. Although we hear from them on a regular and ongoing basis, this is a chance to see if we got it right. So at that meeting, the public will have an opportunity to comment at the beginning of the meeting, as they did today. Staff will provide a much shorter presentation with a little bit of new information, but also to set the stage for deliberations. There will be a detailed staff report, which is informed by questions that I received from council already and may continue to before the next agenda is set. And we'll focus on individual items that impact the tax increase. So certain capital projects, all the supplemental requests. And when when we're done, the results of that March 3rd meeting will be built into a second draft of the financial plan, which council will consider on March 16th. So staff are available between now and then to answer questions from council or the public. We will make every effort to provide responses in a public manner that not just all of council, but all the community members who choose to follow along will see. And that includes the budget page on the town website, which will be full of all the information that we present to council, including copies of this presentation as well as links to the presentation. So those really wishing to dig in can do so. With that, Mr. Chair, I would ask if there are any clarifying questions that I might be able to field at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Hissick. And before I turn to my committee colleagues, I'll take the opportunity to thank you and Ms. Chen from the Finance Department for your work on the budget, as well as all department heads who I know worked hard to submit budget numbers and to be able to prepare this document. And Mr. Hissick, for your again, for your measured presentation. I think it is beneficial. You know, as you noted at the onset, some of us have seen this many times, and perhaps some members of the public haven't, but the walkthrough is, I think, very helpful just to give a good grounding on the first occasion in terms of understanding the budget and how it is prepared and how we've gotten to the position that we're at. So on behalf of the committee, our appreciation to yourself and town staff for your work in preparing the budget. With that, I'll look to my colleagues to see if there are any macro questions of nature for Mr. Hissick. I see Councillor O'Keefe followed by Councillor Novak.
Thank you, Chair. Just some clarification on the amounts that are in here for projects and major expenditures like vehicles and things. Have we been impacted very much by the tariffs that we've heard so much about with any of our projects or you know, major expenditures like for fire trucks or vehicles, that kind of thing?
Thank you, Councillor. Thus far, I would say we have not been severely impacted directly by tariffs, but it's hard to parse that from the overall inflationary factors, although most of that inflation happened before tariffs were in fact announced. I know what I've been coming across is even though there are tariffs, the trade agreements that are in place still apply. It just, a lot of businesses that are subject to some of the potential tariffs are now having to complete the paperwork to prove they fit under those trade agreements, and if so, then the tariffs do not apply. So at this time, I have not seen any instance that I can think of where there was a definite cost item that included a tariff. It's hard to separate that from some of our larger truck purchases, and certainly looking ahead to the next fire vehicle in 2029, I'm really hoping that the situation resolves itself prior to us going down that road.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Novak.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much, Mr. Hissick. I know the amount of work that goes into this is staggering, and I know there's a lot of work that both you and your staff have done to get us to this place here today. And in spite of the fact that we do see this again from year to year, I find it very helpful to get refreshed on some of the inner workings of this process. I have a few questions. They're rather high level. They don't deal with the specifics of the budget, but if you think they're out of order, just please say so, and I won't be upset. The first one is, as you may have heard at the beginning of our meeting tonight, there was a comment from one of the members of the public as to staff wages that had been agreed to in the last meeting and form part of this budget. And there was some talk about the fact that, and I'll use air quotes to say, things are not quite the same as they were in 2014. Things have changed quite a bit since then. Is there any way for us to get any kind of a measure, if you will, of exactly what has changed so that we can perhaps address some of the criticism that has been directed our way by saying, well, this and this and this has changed, and these changes result in additional costs. I know that that might be a tall order, and I don't expect that you would come back to us with that in very short order. But if it is possible to do something like that, that would be great. I don't know if it is.
Councillor Novak, if I may, you're referring to the increases to council remuneration in 2027, is that correct?
But in terms of additions to what might be perceived as our role. In other words,
Fair,
additions in responsibility.
Thank you. You said staff, you referred to staff in your comments, and so I wanted to clarify your reference was meant to be to council as well.
I'm sorry, if I did say that, that was an oversight, so.
Thank you.
We will do our best, Councillor, to come up with that, but largely it's very subjective. I can't objectively tell you what's changed. I think it's a little different for everybody. I can tell you what I feel as someone who's been in this industry for 34 years. It is very, very much a different landscape than it was when I started. There's a lot of it is around public scrutiny and pressure, as well as the ease of providing not just feedback, but negative feedback. That to me has been one thing that has impacted councils probably more than staff. But it's a cumulative thing, and our roles have become far more complex over the last 10, 15, 20 years than they were before. But again, it's very subjective, and different people will perceive it differently.
Okay, thank you. I hope you appreciate that where I'm coming from, I don't have the benefit of the years that some of my colleagues, and certainly not the staff, have in order to have seen that change over the years, whence cometh the question. You mentioned earlier in your presentation, we talked a bit about the consumer price index as a guideline towards increases. And well, I'm not sure that you said directly, there was an implication there that the consumer price index is not a very good yardstick for measuring the changes in our expenditures over time. I guess the term consumer is the operative word there. A consumer basket is certainly not the same thing as the type of expenditures that a municipality would have. My question would be, is there any kind of a benchmark out there that would be able to compare year-over-year expenditures in our business, if you will, in the business of running municipalities, that we could use as a benchmark to determine whether or not we're on course or off course or whatever?
Thank you, Councillor. I would answer that two ways. First of all, in terms of a definitive index, I have not yet been able to find one. I mean, there are various construction cost indices out there, but we're not quite construction either. We're kind of an odd hybrid. But the point I would like to make about it is that whatever index you choose, it measures the same basket of goods. And in our line of business, we keep adding to the basket, unavoidably at times. So it's difficult to just say we should keep up with the cost of things, because we have more things that have cost. And that's really the challenge, and that's not one that the private sector typically faces.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Earlier in the presentation, we talked about using surplus funds to backfill for tax increases in those areas where we had surplus funds. And we had decided that it would be more appropriate to use surplus funds than to actually implement a tax increase. Would it be fair to say that the use of those mitigation type funding avenues doesn't actually replace a tax increase and still leaves us in a more challenging position when looking at the next year, because we haven't raised our taxation baseline sufficiently to mitigate higher increases in the subsequent years?
Thank you, Councillor. That's exactly the point I was trying to get across, is while it's tempting to use available funds when they're in front of you, I think we need to know we're doing it with the consequence of deferring the known tax increases. And we did it for too long, I believe, and the temptation's always there. I mean, I feel the pressure each and every year to come in with the lowest possible number. And if I don't, you guys are gonna lower it for me. So, I mean, we received a lot of money that year. And, you know, certainly the Safe Restart funding for some communities like Vancouver, like Victoria, even in year one, it didn't sufficiently replace the revenues lost in year one. For us, it did. It more than did that. So when someone compares us to a place like Vancouver, where they probably had significant cost increases in the intervening years since 2020 and now have brought it in line, they're just on a different timeline than we're on. So yes, using those mitigation measures means that we've been deferring the increase we've all known is coming.
So then I guess you would say that it's not surprising that we find ourselves with a 12% increase today.
Unfortunately not. I think that's the message we've been hinting at for a number of years and got really serious about last year.
Thank you. My final question. In the past few years, anyway, when you're building the budget, do you factor in a surplus amount, or is the annual surplus simply a result of economies that staff are able to find during the course of the year?
I was speaking to that when I was discussing my comfort level with using surplus to balance the budget. So my intention in a typical year is to break even. And I do that by earmarking a certain amount of surplus funding to balance the budget and not tax for it, but expecting that I will not need to dip into it at the end of the year. So no, I do not typically budget for a surplus, but I will have to when we get serious about replenishing our balance.
Okay, I'm not sure I understood. It sounded like you said that you do build in some surplus in the budget in the goal to arrive at a break-even point. Is that accurate?
I build in surplus on the funding side. So maybe we're saying the same thing different ways, but in my mind, building a surplus into the budget means you're collecting more revenues than you need so you can generate a surplus. I do the opposite of that. I collect less revenue than I need, knowing that we'll find efficiencies and we'll break even, and I cover that gap by using a small allocation of surplus rather than taxing for it. Does that make sense?
Okay, I guess what I'm trying to understand is the surplus calculated or just fortuitous?
Microphone, sorry, thank you.
I got to my comfort level of $250,000 a year through years of experience, knowing this organization and the people in it, and for many, this is my 14th budget that I'm responsible for here. And for about 10 of those years, it was a pretty accurate reflection of the amount I didn't need to tax for. So fortuitous in the sense that there are always things that happen that you cannot fully predict. Generally, there are certain large budget items that are predictable, that you're going to save a certain amount on the RCMP contract in a typical year because we're short a couple of officers. It doesn't always happen, mind you, but 4 years out of 5, at 8 years, 9 years out of 10, it'll happen. So you can budget that you'll see savings there. Things like investment revenues. Sometimes we're conservative with projecting those, and if we do well, we generate a bit of a surplus. So things like that.
So it's kind of a mix of good planning and opportunity. Great, thank you. That's really what I want to hear. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I'm done.
Thank you. Councillor Burnett?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Hissick, for your presentation, and Ms. Chen for being present here. A comment, basically, before I ask a question, just thank you for bringing forth the reserves and budget surplus discussion. As you know well, when we speak, those are my concern areas every time I see the budget. So I'm glad to hear that we're actually having those conversations. With regards to, and I also think it's important that when you were mentioning earlier around fire and police and protective services in general and the workers' compensation or WorkSafe BC they're called now, I think it's important that the community realizes that even if we did nothing else, we'd be looking at a 6.4% increase, and we'd have no say in how that, it's just what it would be. So I think it's important for the public to realize those are costs that we as a council can't even begin to implement or try to cut into. They're just what they are. So my question does pertain to the protective services and noting your comment in here about that this model still is more cost effective for the community that we have. Knowing the structure of the way this works from, I think it's 5,000 to 14,999, and we're in that bracket that we pay 70% of the cost of each officer, and the other 30% is subsidized by senior levels of government. My understanding is once we get over 15,000, then it becomes 90 and 10, so we'd be paying 90%. So I guess I'm wondering from your perspective, getting into that area, I mean, as we look at Bill 44 and the increased pressure to build housing, we're going to get there faster than we probably would have had if we'd not made these changes. Do you see or envision a time where it might be more cost effective to have an amalgamated police service on the peninsula? Sorry for a difficult question.
No pressure there.
Yeah.
Well, certainly we're cognizant of the fact that when the town hits 15,000 in population, and I think we're a couple of censuses away from that, but it's something we would want to prepare for over a number of years once we start getting close, setting a little bit of money aside for it, while concurrently having those kind of investigations about whether it still makes sense to pay 90% or go right to 100 for the difference in service, should there be one. But that, a more complete answer to that is far beyond my capability at this time.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's good to have your insight as somebody who served in this particular role for the community for so long. And I think it is something that as a community or whatever council sits in the future is a discussion that's going to have to start taking place, because we're it may be a couple of censuses, but that comes pretty quick if we're not on top of it. So thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Gurnett. I'll just look to the committee to see if there are any questions. I will try a couple possibly here. Really just because that RCMP dispatch contract, so the police dispatch contract, is such a significant item and a fairly new expense to us. As you noted, part of last year we did pay for that out of surplus. This year we're looking to cover it wholly within the budget. I know in fire service, we can shop around for dispatch services. There are competing dispatch service providers, and so the town has the luxury of being able to look to opportunities, for comprehensive service providers, perhaps at a more reasonable cost with fire dispatch service. Does the same scenario apply to police dispatch, or is it take it or leave it, one service provider?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a lot more constrained for police than it is for fire, but not to say that there aren't alternatives being explored by our communities that were also impacted at the same time. There's 9 other South Island communities that we're working with to look at alternatives, but those will take a couple of years to investigate, and I wouldn't bank on having any alternatives in the next 2 budget years at least, but it is an ongoing investigation, and we are in the loop on what's going on there.
Good. I think that's important for the public to be aware of, and thank you for sharing that. Also, I guess along the same line, there was the prospect, perhaps through UBCM or elsewhere, to look to the province around a cell phone levy potentially to help with 911 costs, and I don't know if that would apply equally to specifically dispatch costs, or if it was just 911 infrastructure. Do we know if that has been advanced provincially to the extent that there may be again some future opportunity to collect revenue through a cell phone levy?
I believe that is an ongoing lobby, and I'm not sure about the current status, but it is something that we are pursuing because it is in place in other provinces.
Okay, thank you. And then lastly, a more challenging question along the lines of Councillor Garnett's question, I believe, and it relates to town property, town-owned property. When staff put together the budget, does staff ever look at town-owned property, the prospect of potentially subdividing a piece of property for sale to generate revenue? Would that be deemed as short-sighted because the land is in such limited supply? Is that something that is explored or entertained at the staff level prior to coming forward with a challenging budget like this?
Honestly, Mr. Chair, we, as a town, do not own a lot of land. We're, fairly constrained geographically. When we have a surplus piece of land like the old fire hall site, that was certainly brought to council for consideration. It wasn't a unanimous decision to sell it. I remember some members wanted to maintain it, but ultimately the decision was made to sell it to offset the cost of the new fire hall. And I think I recall a couple of offhand conversations over the years about maybe looking at some lands that we have set aside right now for future parks where it might not make sense for a park to be there. So it is something that could be looked at in earnest if council directed us to, but it's not something we actively consider ahead of every budget. It's just every now and then when it comes up, we'll throw the idea around a little bit. There have been 2 instances in my recollection where we did sell a small portion of road right-of-way to an adjacent development that brought in a little bit of money, but that only makes sense in areas where we know that the full right-of-way will almost never be used.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I will again turn to committee in the chance that there are any further questions of Mr. Hissick. I'll go first to Councillor Duck as a first-time speaker.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Hissick, for your presentation. As we start to move into the future, are we looking at the impact and utilization of artificial intelligence in doing some of the services?
It's certainly something we will be looking at, but it's very early days to predict how that will turn out.
Along those lines, so are we starting to look at places where we can do service reductions as we start to evaluate our future, this budget and future budgets, is to say, okay, how do we start to curtail the continuing increase in property taxes to the residents of Sydney?
It's an emerging technology that we'll be paying close attention to, but AI doesn't fight fires, save lives, or provide policing. So we're really looking at some of the more mundane, perhaps, services that aren't protective in nature. But again, another thing AI does not do is road maintenance and things like that. So obviously we're aware of it, and we'll look to make as much use of it as possible. But we're far from being able to say that it's going to replace function A, B, or C.
Thank you. And along those lines, so if we're not looking at those service, other areas, we can start to look at service reductions to start to curtail the expense we're incurring.
Looking at service reductions is always a possibility. I'm not sure how that would fly in the face of the recent survey and the value people placed on what they get from the town. So it's really a council decision.
Well, as you noted in your presentation, that survey was done last year's increase, and now we're going to have 2 subsequent years of significant increases. So that, in combination with the recent provincial decision to their property tax deferral program is going to go to prime +2 versus prime -2. So that's a 4% increase in property tax deferral interest rates. That's announced today.
Just to clarify on the deferral program, the only change I'm aware of is a change from simple interest to compound.
Yeah, as was released today, that impact is going to be prime +2 for property tax deferral rates. So yeah, I mean, it doesn't directly impact the town, but it does impact the people who are making those considerations, and I think they'll be paying a lot more attention to our property taxes and what that impact is on them that hasn't been as evident in the past. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Duck. Unless there are any other first-time speakers, Councillor Keith?
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick one, since you brought up the dispatch costs. And I think I know the answer, but just because a citizen asked me, they wanted to know, do we share those costs with North Saanich because we share the RCMP, or is each municipality paying that amount?
They get their own cost billed directly to them. It's not one of the costs that we share. What we do share is the building as well as all the staffing. We also each pay for our own set of officers. So we have 16, they have 12, and that's something that's billed directly to them.
Okay. And is there an opportunity, or did we question that model in terms of like why one police force would have 2 separate dispatch kind of charges?
Well, if they were to combine them, it would be roughly double, and then I'd bill North Saanich for their share.
Okay, so
it's really,
okay.
as far as I know, and it's been fairly difficult to get a full and complete answer out of ECOM for how the costs are allocated. It's very much based on call volumes at a detachment, so they'd be looking at the overall volumes, and what they're doing now is splitting that between the jurisdictions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm looking around committee, not seeing any further questions. So at this point, I'll conclude Mr. Hissick's presentation Q&A. Thank you again, Mr. Hissick and staff, for your work on the budget. Certainly appreciated. That is our only agenda item this evening. I'll take the opportunity to thank the public for attending and for your interest in the budget process. Prior to wrapping up, I see Mr. Edwards has a comment. Mr. Edwards?
Oh, thank you, Chair. If it's all right with you, I wouldn't mind responding to a couple of the questions and comments made by members of council in relation to this presentation.
Please.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to touch briefly on some of the items. Those are all very good questions, and thank you to Mr. Hissick for the presentation. It's always sobering but beneficial to get that overview again. In terms of the population growth that I believe was raised earlier on in a question, we have done some of our own population forecasting, and I've effectively done 4 different population forecast models, ranging from the historical growth patterns to more generous growth patterns based on just the more recent significant growth that we've witnessed, which was between the last 2 censuses. We saw the most significant growth in Sydney over decades. And no matter whether we use the more longer term historical growth trends or this last 5-year dramatic growth trend, we likely wouldn't be hitting the 15,000 mark until the 2041 census. But again, that will come quickly, as the councillor identified. So it is something we are paying close attention to, because whether it's going to be happening in 15 years from now or longer, we definitely want to start planning for that, because that'll be a significant cost pressure. But I just wanted to clarify that we don't anticipate it happening even within the next censuses. So we are forecasting out further. And with regard to the question of sale of property, I think that our CFO answered that very well, and I would agree wholeheartedly. That's something that we do want to always be looking at, but we are very short on land, so that option is often negated quite quickly. And I did want to touch also on the cell phone levy. I do know that we did get an update from the province on the cell phone levy initiative that is underway, and so I'm really pleased to hear that the province is truly looking at that, which will help defray some of those costs. I don't think it'll be a significant or really big reduction to our costs, but it will help for sure. And then in terms of service reductions, I think that's something that we're always willing to look at. We, as is mentioned in the materials, we do look at this at our building our budgets, not as from a rollover perspective, but from a go forward perspective. And so if that's something the council wants us to take a more focused look at, will take a significant effort, but it is always an option for us to consider. And lastly, I did want to touch on that new property tax deferral program change. While it will have I think a rather significant impact on people participating in that program, it's still a fantastic program, and I encourage people to participate in it, because it won't impact your current day cash flow, because it's still a property tax deferral. The impact is when you turn to sell your home and you're required to actually pay out the deferral. And so, but the rates that they're moving towards, while it's now a 2% compounding monthly, is more aligned with like the commercial rates. It's still dramatically less than what you could get from the private sector. So it's a significant change for sure, but it won't impact anybody participating in the program from a cash flow perspective. And so again, thank you to Mr. Hissick and his team for all his efforts on putting this together. And that's all I had, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards, and thank you for joining us this evening from your conference. Appreciate your insight on those items. With that, I'll just conclude again by thanking members of the public for being in attendance and for your interest in the budget process. This is the beginning of the process. This was our first opportunity to review the draft budget. As Mr. Hissick noted, the next budget meeting in council chambers is March the 3rd at 6 p.m. With that, I'll look for a motion to adjourn. Councillor Duck, Councillor Novak, all those in favor? Motion's carried. Thank you. Good night.